People are weird about protesters, man. When I first started doing videos about the suffragettes, I thought this was all pretty settled history. I thought we were all pretty on board. But in 2022, two activists from the climate group Just Stop Oil climbed up the cables on the Dartford Crossing Bridge and were handed the longest ever sentences in a case of non-violent protest in this country in modern times. And the comments that I was getting on these suffragette videos were weird.
The suffragettes never wanted power for all, just themselves. Like Karens throughout time. Because working class women have always had to work, and the whole feminist movement is based on bored middle class busybodies with nothing better to do once their kids are with the nanny and the house is cleaned by a maid. The worst idea of modern time was giving women the vote. Dumb. Suffragettes didn't advocate for working class women to get the right to vote. People also don't know that many suffragettes went on to be actual fascist black shirts. I think by rational conclusion, I choose to be misogynistic at this point. My answer to your smirk smile. Not to mention how they only wanted the votes for white women. Most women didn't want the right to vote anyway. People seem to neglect to mention many men couldn't vote. The suffragettes gave out white feathers. I suppose that they wanted the right to vote to send men to war. Men never got given the right to vote. Any mention of the fact that at the time majority of women didn't actually want a right to vote if it meant they got forcefully drafted too, or does women being equal only factor in when it's comfortable?
So clearly this isn't settled history. There are still people who have a lot of questions about the suffragettes. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to try and answer these questions, and I'm going to answer them in the best faith I can, and we're going to see what it can tell us about 21st century protest movements. Now, I have had some version of this script sat in my drafts for years, and the reason I haven't made it is because this subject feels very personal to me in a way that other historical injustices don't. Now, I know some people, when they get defensive, they get the mama bear instinct and they become excellent, eloquent speakers. I am not like that. When I get defensive, I get stupid. This is something I know about myself. I've had a lot of practice noticing the feeling. So I'm going to be very thorough about providing sources and evidence every time I say a fact. If you would like to disagree with something I say, that is totally fine, but you are going to have to provide a source too. Do not just tell me to Google it. Tell me where you found it. I would do the same thing for you. As always, I am a London tour guide, so I'm going to be talking about the suffragettes in Britain and especially in London. I understand things panned out differently in the US and in Australia and Switzerland, but you guys have got to deal with that by yourselves, okay? First, let's all get on the same page about what the suffragette movement actually is.
I'd been hearing about suffragettes for years before I heard anyone explain what the term suffrage actually means. It just means the vote. It's not specific to women. All sorts of people in this country have fought for the right to vote. In 1800, less than 3% of the UK's population could vote. Usually you had to own a certain amount of property or live in a house of a certain value in order to qualify, which excluded not only large parts of the working class, but also people in prisons and lunatic asylums. The exact amount of property you needed to own was different depending on where you lived, so it was easier to qualify if you lived in, say, Herefordshire than if you lived in Middlesex. In some towns, the local council just decided who was elected, and no one got to vote at all. One of the best places to get the vote was Westminster itself, the seat of government, where you only needed to be earning enough to pay your local parish and church taxes to qualify. Technically, women weren't explicitly barred from voting, But since a married woman's possessions belong to her husband, and you're legally allowed to be paid much less than a man if you want to eat, so you'd better get married, it was rare for women to qualify. And when they did, there were strong social prohibitions against casting their vote. In 1832, women were explicitly barred from voting in general elections altogether. And people are fed up. In the 1830s and 1840s, there's a huge popular movement for working class people to get the vote. It's called Chartism, after the People's Charter that they draw up, outlining the reforms they want to see. It's hard to convey these days just how massive the Chartist movement is. They have their own newspaper that outsells the Times. Their demonstrations regularly attract tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. Look at this photo of their rally in Kennington Common in 1848. Chartists demand an end to property qualifications for voting and for becoming an MP, and a salary for MPs for the first time, so that men who rely on their work to make a living are able to leave their jobs and go to Parliament, rather than just leaving it to the blokes who have enough money not to work for years. And most importantly, they demand the vote for all men aged 21 and over. But what about women? Well, women are a big part of the Chartist movement, and so this is something that Chartists are thinking about as early as the 1830s. But ultimately, the people who write the charter decide that votes for women is too radical, and that they don't want to risk men not joining the movement because they're put off by the demand for women to get the vote. The introduction to the charter says that when it comes to women's suffrage, we have no just argument to adduce, but only to express our fears of entertaining it, lest the false estimate man entertains of this half of the human family may cause his own ignorance and prejudice to be enlisted to retard the progress of his own freedom. Historians still argue about whether this was a good idea or not. The charitable interpretation is, we would love women to vote, but we have to be practical, and the fact that it ends up taking so long to get working class men the right to vote shows that women's suffrage really was too radical at the time and would have fractured the movement. The uncharitable interpretation is, we would rather have sexist men join the movement than women. And Chartists are considered dangerous radicals. Chartist leaders like Fergus O'Connor, William Cuffey, and George Julian Harney are arrested, soldiers attack their gatherings, and some Chartists are transported to Australia. And although the Chartist movement is pretty thoroughly dissipated after 1848, over the course of the 19th century, the number of people who can vote does keep going up, thanks to successive reform acts that keep lowering that amount of property you have to own or the value of the house that you're renting. These days, almost everything that the Chartists fought for is considered normal. If a country didn't have most of the things they demanded, you would consider it undemocratic, and maybe even a tyranny. There are new laws in 1832, 1867, 1884 and 1885 called the Reform Acts that keep increasing the number of men who can vote. And by 1900, we don't quite have universal male suffrage yet, but a majority of adult men in the UK have the right to vote. By contrast, women's suffrage had budged much more slowly. There'd been a movement for women to get the vote since the 1850s, mostly writing petitions. Hundreds of women's suffrage petitions made their way to Parliament over the 19th century, with ever-increasing numbers of signatures. And there was a tiny amount of movement. In 1870, women are allowed to vote for school board members, whether they are married or not. By 1884, you also get to keep your property and your money when you marry, instead of it all going to your husband. So if women were to get the vote in the future, they would be more likely to pass the property qualification. When county councils and parish councils were created in the 1880s and 1890s, women were allowed to vote for them. The largest suffrage organisation was the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, or NUWSS, headed by Millicent Garrett Fawcett. But by the 1900s, they hadn't got very far. Women's suffrage wasn't a big talking point on the national agenda. Most people in 1900 thought that the idea of women's suffrage was so absurd as to be hilarious. It was uncomfortable to deal with women on serious matters. Suffragists were generally laughed at, portrayed as the shrieking sisterhood and frumpy blue stockings, overeducated, ugly, snaggle-toothed crones who only wanted the vote because they couldn't catch a husband. Winston Churchill said that only the most undesirable class of women are eager for the right. Those women who discharge their duty to their state, viz. Marrying and giving birth to children, are adequately represented by their husbands. If you give women votes, you must ultimately allow women to sit as members of Parliament. They were belittled, ignored, and generally not taken seriously. I wonder why. And so one woman took it upon herself to change all that. Weren't the suffragettes terrorists? This is Emmeline Pankhurst, one of the most famous women in the suffrage movement, and almost ubiquitously known at the time as simply Mrs. Pankhurst. She was disappointed with the movement's lack of success, and so in 1903, she and her daughters, Christabel, Sylvia and Adela, formed a splinter group called the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. The WSPU were always tiny compared to the NUWSS, but they are much more famous because they were what was called militant. Now, these days, the word militant conjures up images of armed insurrections and terrorist bombings, but it doesn't necessarily mean violent. We're going to use the word militant kind of a lot today, so this is important. Militant doesn't necessarily mean that anyone gets hurt. Militant just means aggressive. And if you're a corseted, feather-hatted Edwardian lady, then almost any kind of protest is going to seem militant. Heckling is militant. Graffiti is militant. People called going on a march militant back then. Another way that the WSPU was militant was that Mrs. Pankhurst consciously modelled it on the army. Ironically, for an organisation campaigning for the vote, it wasn't democratic. Unlike other suffrage groups in the WSPU, you couldn't vote for your board leaders. Mrs. Pankhurst was your general, and you were her loyal foot soldiers, expected to follow orders and fall into line. The first militant action the WSPU undertook was in 1905. There was a cabinet minister giving a speech, and Christabel Pankhurst and her friend Annie Kenney stood up in the audience and started interrupting him, asking, "When will the minister give women the vote?" They are both forcibly removed from the meeting and are given short prison sentences. Even in the courtroom, you can get an idea of how people felt about women's suffrage from the fact that whenever Christabel said something like, "We want votes," everyone laughed. The next day, the press is full of stories about what an awful woman Miss Pankhurst is, and coincidentally, give the movement the best publicity it's ever had. In 1906, the term suffragette is coined by, of all people, the Daily Mail. At first, they mean it as a pretty backhanded compliment. The "et" suffix usually means something small and diminutive and unthreatening. So it was like they were patting the suffragettes on the head, going, "Ah, it's almost like you have a real social movement. Good for you." But within the year, activists had reclaimed the term and were using it to describe themselves, and it even becomes the name of the WSPU newspaper. These days, it's a really useful word for us to be able to differentiate the militant side of the movement, the suffragettes, from the much larger, non-militant side, the suffragists. But this militancy was a really new thing for the women's movement. The simple act of marching with banners and placards was not something respectable people did, let alone committing acts of civil disobedience. And women were meant to be the guardians of morality. However, to keep getting press, after a while, marching and interrupting meetings wasn't enough. In order to keep getting headlines, they had to keep causing outrage. We often think of suffragettes as chaining themselves to railings, and some of them do that, but what they were famous for at the time was window breaking. You would go out, sometimes in a big group, to a street with a lot of shops, and you would smash all the windows with stones or hammers. The WSPU maintained that they wished to hurt not a cat or canary, and some suffragettes wrapped their stones in paper
partly so they could write slogans on them, but also partly so it was less likely to hurt anyone inside. Suffragette Ada Wright said that she was so nervous about breaking windows that it was quite a relief when she was arrested, because then she didn't have to do it anymore. The rationale behind the window breaking was partly to get headlines and partly to get the attention of the property-owning men who could vote. But again, after a while, that stops getting headlines. In 1909, Winston Churchill was getting off a train at Bristol when Theresa Garnett pushed through a crowd and hit him in the head with a horsewhip. Mary Lee throws a hatchet at the Prime Minister, missing him and hitting a man next to him in the ear. But it's in the 1910s that the campaign really starts to reach fevered levels. In 1912, they start an arson campaign, starting off first by setting fire to post boxes and moving up to whole buildings. They always target empty buildings, but honestly, they're lucky they never slipped up and killed someone by accident. They also start cutting telephone lines and making phone calls to the fire brigade. The next year, they start digging up golf courses. In 1914, Mary Richardson slashes a famous 17th century painting in the National Gallery. The inside of Birmingham Cathedral is painted with suffragette slogans, and someone sets off a bomb in Westminster Abbey. Now, they're pretty small, weak bombs compared to what we see on the news these days, but still, if that happened today, the press would undoubtedly call the suffragettes a terrorist movement. So I think it's really interesting that we teach it to kids in such an empowering way. You wouldn't think Mrs. Pankhurst would make a very good kids' story, but we've managed it. Hey kids, be just like Emmeline Pankhurst. Dream big. Don't let any mean boys tell you can't do something. But it's setting kids up to fail if you tell them to try and achieve their dreams just like Emmeline Pankhurst, without telling them how she did it. Just 5 years after the WSPU was formed, the issue starts being taken seriously for the first time on a national stage. The WSPU were regularly filling the Royal Albert Hall 3 times a year. Their political campaign against Winston Churchill causes him to lose a by-election, and a safe seat has to be hastily found for him elsewhere. In June 1908, 30,000 suffragettes marched through Hyde Park, attracting an estimated audience of 250,000. As much as the government of the day is trying to ignore the question, politicians are now expected to take the matter seriously, rather than as a joke. And we shouldn't talk about suffragette violence without mentioning the violence done by the state against suffragettes. When the public disagreed with suffragettes, they didn't keep it to words. Suffragettes were pelted with eggs, banners were ripped out of hands, and onlookers physically grabbed them and threw them to the ground. Suffragettes were punched and kicked, their skirts were lifted up and their blouses torn off, their arms were pinned back while members of the crowd hit them. One suffragette, called Helen Ogston, said that a man once pressed a lit cigar into her arm. When protesters interrupted the 1909 Eisteddfod at the Royal Albert Hall, a steward threw an elderly suffragist down a flight of stairs. Millicent Garrett Fawcett says that at one political meeting she saw a girl violently struggling in the clutches of 4 men, and while in this defenceless position, violently smitten on the face by enraged members of the Liberal Party. So this wasn't some random passers-by, this was politicians hitting a woman in the face. But the actions of anti-suffrage members of the public were pretty small potatoes compared to the violence committed by the police and the prison system. The 18th of November 1910 saw a large-scale suffragette demonstration in front of the Houses of Parliament being set upon by both onlookers and the police in what was known as Black Friday. Some protesters were run down by police horses, one woman was thrown out of her wheelchair, 2 sustained injuries that would contribute to their early deaths. One woman was being beaten up by onlookers and she had to smash a window so that the police would arrest her to get it to stop. Charles Mansell Moulin, whose wife was a suffragette, wrote that their arms were twisted until they were almost broken, their thumbs were forcibly bent back, and they were tortured in other nameless ways that made one feel sick at the sight. Another witness, Marguerite Charter, wrote that she saw a woman being tackled by a police officer. She fell with a sickening thud. I think that even that valiant policeman was a little alarmed at her condition. And the violence didn't stop when suffragettes got to prison. Suffragettes argue that they should count as political prisoners, but as the campaign ramps up, they are increasingly put in the general population. In July 1909, Marion Wallace Dunlop protests this decision by going on hunger strike, a tactic copied from Irish Republicans. She loses weight very quickly, and the prison authorities get scared that she's going to die. She is let out within 91 hours. So, of course, all the suffragettes start doing it. By September of that year, the fact that suffragettes aren't serving their full sentences has become very embarrassing to the government. And so the woman who will go on to throw the hatchet at the Prime Minister becomes the first suffragette to be force-fed. I was taught about force-feeding in school, and you understand what it is from the words, but I didn't really know how it worked until later in life. So, with a suitable warning that we're about to talk about torture and sexual assault, and a time code on the screen that you can skip to if you like, this is what force-feeding actually consisted of. You're in your cell, and the prison doctor comes in with usually 2 female prison warders, although some suffragettes report 5 or 6. They will hold you down while the doctor takes out a rubber tube and tries to push it down your throat. Now, your first instinct when he does this is going to be to clamp your jaw shut. But if you do that, he will try and put it down your nose instead. And these tubes are not meant for the nose, and these are little Edwardian ladies, so sometimes he has to kind of jam it in. Some tubes even have glass sections in them so that the doctor can see if there's a blockage. Accounts from people who were force-fed says that it feels like you're choking, so you can't help but cough the tube back up. The doctor might have to put it back in 3 or 4 times before it works. Several suffragettes recount that sometimes the doctor would accidentally put the tube down your windpipe instead. Then they're going to pour down milk, sometimes with a bit of bran in there, like very milky Weetabix. Your immediate reaction is, of course, going to be to throw all that straight back up, so they will keep you held down, sometimes for hours, until you've digested it. And that's 3 times a day. Side effects from force feeding include coughing, chills, losing your voice, bruising and nerve damage where you've been held down, vomiting, partial paralysis, and pleurisy. The guards could hit you or throw you on the floor or sit on your chest during the feeding. Frances Parker, who wrote under the name Janet Arthur, describes multiple assaults where the prison warders insert the tube into her rectum and once into her vagina. She hadn't even been convicted of anything. Lillian Lenton almost died in 1913 when food was accidentally poured into her lungs. What this isn't is a substitute for food. Hunger strikers still lost frightening amounts of weight and still had to be released early. Since the procedure has no medical value then, in 1912, the medical experts at the Lancet magazine called it what it is: torture. The suffragette Kitty Marion was force-fed 232 times. Historians often point to force-feeding more than the militant campaigns as the thing that starts to garner sympathy from the public and turn the tide of opinion in the suffragettes' favour. Although, of course, they wouldn't have been force-fed in the first place if they weren't committing violent crimes. It's worth noting that no prison ever dared force-feed Emmeline Pankhurst. She was on the older side, and they did not want to make a martyr of her.
Weren't they racist?
Britain has never had a colour bar on the vote. The act that eventually gave women the vote didn't refer to race, or even to people born in Britain. You just had to live in your constituency. To this day, a citizen of any Commonwealth country with the right to work in the UK can vote, and even run for Parliament, without being a British citizen. The first known black voter was Ignatius Sancho in 1774, and we only know that he was black because he was a pretty well-connected guy who wrote about his life and got his portrait painted. There might be black voters further back that we don't know about,
because their race isn't recorded. What that means is that in the UK, the women's suffrage movement isn't having to debate whether white women or black men should get the vote first. Black men who meet the property qualifications already have the vote. And the suffragettes are trying to get the vote on the same basis as men. So if white women get the vote, then women from ethnic minorities will too. Like, these were people from the 1900s. I'm sure they were plenty racist, but they don't make it part of their platform or talk about race much in their campaign. Still, you would expect to find some black and Asian suffragists, right? But it's really hard to find them in the historical record. Most suffragists are only recorded by name, without a photo. You'll see them listed on petitions or mentioned in newspaper articles, but generally no race is mentioned. The WSPU didn't even keep an official membership list, because that could have been used against them by police. When we do find names on petitions or in articles, you often can't just go and look up their birth certificate or census data to find out what race they were. Ethnicity data wasn't collected on the census until 1991. So there might have been black suffragists that signed petitions, but we don't know about them. They tend to have English names, so you can't even spot them that way. It would also be, on average, harder for a black woman to be a suffragette. A lot of black women in the UK at the time were working as domestic servants, which means you basically have no free time to go to marches or hear political speeches, and you have to worry about your employer firing you for your political beliefs. Almost no domestic servants of any race were involved in the movement. Also, in the 1910s, black people would have been a much smaller percentage of the population compared to, say, the 1910s United States or modern-day Britain. And a large portion of the black people who were living in the UK at the time were single men working as sailors, not women. However, I can tell you about two black suffragists active in the UK. One is Sarah Parker Remond, an American abolitionist who lived in the UK. In 1866, she signs a petition for women to get the vote, writing, "I have been received here as the sister of the white woman." The other is Donald Adolphus Brown, a mixed-race man married to a white suffragette called Adelaide Knight. He totally supported her participation in the movement, running the household and looking after the baby while she was in prison, and later she and Donald both joined the Adult Suffrage Society. This isn't to say there aren't more, but those are two I've managed to dig up. If you can find more, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Indian women are easier to find in the records because they're more likely to have Indian names. If they're living in Britain in the 1910s, they're also more likely to be wealthy or from a high social class, so it's easier for them to participate. That's definitely the case for Sophia Duleep Singh. Her father was a deposed Maharaja who was living in Britain, and she was goddaughter to Queen Victoria. She was raised as an aristocratic lady, and she was given an allowance so she didn't have to work. She supported Indian and Sikh organisations like the Lascars Club and the Indian Women's Education Association, and she was present on Black Friday, during which she rescued a fellow suffragette from a police officer and even made an official complaint about him. She wrote, "The policeman was unnecessarily brutal and rough, and Princess Sophia hopes that he will be suitably punished." She sold copies of the WSPU newspaper outside Hampton Court Palace to raise money. She refused to pay her dog, carriage and manservant licences, saying, "When the women of England are enfranchised, and the state acknowledges me as a citizen, I shall of course pay my share willingly towards its upkeep." And in 1911, she defaces her census form, writing, "No vote, no census. As women do not count, they refuse to be counted. I have a conscientious objection to filling up this form." Another Indian suffragette was Sushama Sen, who was part of a WSPU deputation in 1910 alongside Mrs. Pankhurst. This photograph shows 6 Indian women taking part in a suffrage procession, possibly Mrs. Lalita Roy, her 3 daughters Miravati, Hiravati and Lelavati, Bhagwati Bolanauth, and a 6th unknown woman stood behind the banner. Behind them, you can also see the banner for women representing the Crown, colonies and protectorates, but sadly we don't have a photo of them. Suffragettes in Britain are really interested in suffrage movements in other countries, if for no other reason than to swap tactics that work. I particularly like this article from Votes for Women about Maori suffragettes. In The Politics of Women's Suffrage, Local, National and International Dimensions, Nicoletta F. Galacci notes that when Britain and the US had their centenaries of women getting the vote, the celebrations were much stronger here and much more muted across the pond, which she attributes to shame over how the 19th Amendment, which gave the first American women the right to vote, did nothing to improve African Americans' access to the ballot box. Despite the tremendous success of the British women's suffrage centenary, by 2020 Americans were largely unable to unequivocally embrace even worthy suffrage efforts. The perceived sellout of African Americans by the suffragists has left a bitter taste. So it's not made completely impossible for women from ethnic minorities to take part in the movement, but it is harder, which results in them taking up a smaller portion of suffragettes than you'd expect. I've never found anything from a white suffragette saying that the movement should focus on making it easier for women from ethnic minorities to take part. Ideas that seem quite natural to us about equal access and lowering barriers to entry haven't really coalesced yet. The thing that really does divide the suffrage movement is class. Didn't they only want the votes for middle-class women?
Most really famous suffragists and suffragettes are middle-class women, like Mrs. Pankhurst and Mrs. Fawcett, but it's not hard to find upper-class women in the movement, like Sophia Duleep Singh or Lady Constance Lytton. It's also not difficult to find working-class women, like Annie Kenney or Leonora Cohen, who were among its most radical members. Annie Kenney worked in a cotton mill from the age of 10, and Leonora Cohen was apprenticed to a milliner at the age of 14. In fact, there were thousands of working-class suffragists. The East London Federation of Suffragettes was a splinter group of the WSPU that focused on working-class issues, and actually operated far longer than the WSPU. They carried on until the 1920s. But, again, it was harder for working class women to participate. There are barriers in their way that simply don't exist for middle or upper class women. You have to get time off your job to turn up to a march or a demonstration, and you could be fired just for supporting women's suffrage back then, let alone for being sent to prison. It could ruin your job prospects for the rest of your life. Your organisation might ask you to wear their colours, and you might not have the money to have a new dress made in the proper colours. You would also be treated worse by the police and the prison than your middle-class counterparts. The upper-class suffragette Lady Constance Lytton actually tested this theory by getting arrested in disguise as a seamstress. She gave the name Jane Wharton, and she found that the prison officers were much more brutal to her. They hit her in the face and force-fed her, which they didn't do when they knew she was the sister of an earl. When police break up a working-class suffrage meeting in Bow Baths in 1913, they knock one woman unconscious and fracture her skull. Also, working-class issues are hotly debated in suffrage circles and often lead to groups splitting apart permanently. For example, in 1907, the WSPU decided that none of their members were allowed to campaign for any political candidate until women got the vote. And then later, they revised that to say that members should campaign against candidates who were in the party currently in government and remain neutral on everyone else, meaning sometimes they were campaigning against government MPs who were pro-suffrage. So a lot of working class women ended up leaving to join another group where they could support Labour candidates. A lot of working class suffragists worked through Labour organisations like the Women's Trade Union Association and the Independent Labour Party, rather than joining a group that was just working for the vote. There were lots of other reasons that working class suffragettes butted up against Mrs. Pankhurst's leadership too. Teresa Billington Gregg wrote that the WSPU was about to adopt a constitution when Mrs. Pankhurst announced that she alone would be directing the group as a dictatorship, and she trampled the draft constitution underfoot, and the meeting broke up in confusion. 70 suffragettes, including Billington Gregg, form a break-off group called the Women's Freedom League, which elected its leaders. And she is openly critical of the WSPU's class politics, saying they gradually edged the working class element out of its ranks. It is true that suffragists disagreed on the question of whether or not they should work for having the vote on the same basis as men, which would mean only property-owning women would get the vote, or whether it was worth pushing for what was called universal suffrage, abolishing the property requirement at the same time as women getting the vote. There were definitely suffragists who thought the same as the Chartists had done 80 years before, that asking for universal suffrage would be too much, and they risked the government not letting any women vote in order to stop working class people voting. And this isn't only an issue of class oppression, there's party politics in the way too. If you only give the vote to women who've got property, a lot of people at the time thought that they would mostly be Conservative voters. So if you're a Liberal politician, that doesn't give you a lot of incentive to support votes for women. And for a lot of women, the vote didn't seem like the most important issue in their lives. In A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf says that on the day women got the vote, she also got a letter from a solicitor saying that her aunt had left her some money in her will, enough to live off. And she says that was much more important to her and much more liberating than the vote. Working class women wanted equal pay so that their boss couldn't legally pay them a third of what a man earned. They wanted decent housing and education for their children, old age pensions. Jewish East End suffragette Rose Winthrop said, "How shall we benefit if, instead of electing our master as we do today, we elect his wife to govern us?" One of the big issues for working class suffragists was actually Irish independence, or Home Rule. There was a big Irish population among the urban working class, and in Ireland itself, the suffrage movement and the independence movement were closely woven together. Irish unionists promised the suffragettes that they would support them if the suffragettes supported Great Britain remaining in Ireland. But working class suffragettes risked breaking that truce by inviting Irish Republicans to speak at their meetings. In 1912, Sylvia Pankhurst went to East London to found the East London Federation of Suffragettes, beautifully shortened to ELFs. And although they worked for the vote, they were also interested in these other issues. Mrs. Pankhurst and Christabel actually cut ties with Sylvia over this, saying she was diluting the movement. According to Sylvia, Christabel said of working class women that their lives were too hard, their education too meagre to equip them for the contest. The ELFs moved away from the militant tactics of the WSPU and started focusing on things like hosting fundraiser parties or setting up charity shops. They opened up milk depots where children could get free milk, cheap restaurants where you could get food at cost price, and a factory that paid its workers a living wage and had a creche on site. They ran elocution lessons to train up their members to be good public speakers, and at their headquarters they hosted lectures, concerts, plays, a choir, and even jiu-jitsu lessons. In the end, the 1918 bill that gave some women the right to vote also got rid of the property qualification, so it no longer mattered what kind of house you were living in. So we'll never know how many property-owning suffragists would have stuck around to make sure their working-class sisters got equal franchise. If you want to argue that there was a dedicated effort on the part of middle-class suffragettes to exclude working-class people, then you have to at least admit that it wasn't big enough to be successful. But still, in 1918, women don't get the right to vote on quite the same basis as men. You have to be over 30, whereas men only have to be over 21. This is much more about the government not wanting women to be over 50% of the electorate.
What about the men who were suffragists?
Of course. What about the men? It's important to recognise the contributions of those who have been left out of the history books. Seriously though, there were male suffragists and they do get left out. One of the first early supporters in Parliament for women's suffrage is John Stuart Mill, and in the 1900s you have prominent supporters like George Bernard Shaw and Keir Hardie. You could join the NUWSS. After 1913 you couldn't join the WSPU, but if you went to prison for the cause, the WSPU would report on you if you were a man, so you can find them in the WSPU's newspapers. Some men went to prison for window smashing and arson, and a few were force-fed. Out of the 1,300 suffragettes arrested between 1905 and 1914, an estimated 100 were men. The most notable man in the militant movement was probably Frederick Pethick Lawrence, who was the husband of the WSPU's treasurer, Emmeline Pethick Lawrence. He was a barrister, so he was really good for helping with legal battles, and he helped to edit the WSPU's newspaper. He went to prison and he was force-fed. During Black Friday, the WSPU organised groups of male supporters to clear their way through the crowd so that the women could get to Parliament. So these were blokes literally putting their bodies on the line for women's suffrage, and 4 of them were arrested. So that would be Hugh Arthur Franklin, Captain Charles Gonne, Walter Hancock and Francis Henderson. So yes, there were male suffragists and suffragettes, and although I think they were reported on fairly at the time, modern retellings do have a tendency to leave them out. It's sometimes harder to spot them in photos because they don't tend to wear the colours of the organisation they're marching for, but they're absolutely there. We talk a lot about representation in history, and we tend to forget to include allies in that. But I think including allies is really important. If you're a numerical minority, or if you don't have the vote, you're going to need allies in order to get what you want politically. Like, they are necessary for your movement. And not everyone's got the imagination to invent a place for themselves in a movement from scratch without looking at historic role models. I know I don't. People need to be able to imagine themselves as heroic, you know? So if you're a bloke who supports women's rights and you're not sure what to do in a given situation, just think, what would Hugh Arthur Franklin do?
What about the women who are anti-suffragists?
There were definitely women who were anti-suffrage. And we talk a lot about how heroic the suffrage movement was, but the reason they're heroic is because they were not mainstream. Part of the reason it took so long for women to get the vote is because the men in Parliament didn't want it, but part of the reason that the men in Parliament didn't want it is because they weren't sure that the public wanted it. Anti-suffrage cartoons were relatively common, and they're pretty funny to look back on now, but they were printed in national newspapers. Like, they were terrified that as soon as women get the vote, they're going to start asking their husbands to look after the children. The National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage had 42,000 members by 1914, and they were putting together petitions with 500,000 signatures on them. They were demanding a referendum on women's suffrage because they were confident that if you asked the voting public, they would say no. Galaxy brain move, honestly. Now, that organisation was founded by men, but some of them, like the Women's National Anti-Suffrage League, are founded by women. And when they're founded in 1908, Mary Ward gives a speech about her reasons for opposing women's suffrage. She says that men and women naturally have different roles in the organisation of the state, that the things that Parliament are involved in are things like the army and finance and mining and shipping, none of which she thought women had any part in. She thought that having the vote would distract women from their household duties. She thought that having a voice in local government was enough. And she thought that women were unsuited to government by nature and circumstance, and that therefore giving them the vote would result in the country collapsing. I'm not going to bother refuting all her points here, but that might be a fun homework exercise for you to try in the comments. Try rebutting her points without the benefit of hindsight. Like, how would you argue against her in 1908?
Didn't the suffragettes send men off to die in World War I?
A few days after... What?
So you got the vote, but not conscription. The suffragettes
Fair
gave
trade.
out white feathers. I suppose they wanted the right to vote so they could send men
Make
to
women
war.
subject to the draft, I say. You want equality?
Vote,
You got
they'll be
it.
subject to a mandatory draft when the time comes to die for king and country.
Many women
That's how the
didn't
men
want
got
the right
their
to
vote.
vote, as it came with other responsibilities, such as the military draft.
Any
Men
mention
were
of the
never
fact that
given
at the
the
time
right
the
to
majority
vote.
of women
The
didn't
cost
want the
of
right to
voting
vote if it
was
meant
that
they
you
got
had to go
forcefully
and die
drafted.
for
And guys that don't even have to do military service.
And
Funny, the earliest feminists that fought for women's rights jumped at the chance to harass men in World War I with the White Feather campaign to send more men to die in the trenches.
If I get drafted while women around me aren't, the second I get my hands on a real weapon is the second I'ma pull out my
That's the
trusted...
Geneva checklist.
Okay, I can see tempers are running high. This is obviously something people feel strongly about, and I get that. The idea of being forced to go to war is terrifying. No need to threaten me with war crimes. Here's what suffragettes and suffragists were actually doing during the First World War. On the outbreak of the war, the WSPU declares a truce with the government, and the Home Secretary releases all suffragette prisoners. Instead, Mrs. Pankhurst directs her efforts towards demanding the right of women to participate in war work. She winds up the WSPU, stops publishing her newspaper, The Suffragette, and starts publishing a pro-war newspaper called Britannia. She supports the war effort in a big way, saying, "We are engaged in a righteous war. Much as I love peace, I believe there are times when it is right to fight." We often have the idea that when the war began, the government called upon women to help out, do their part, and take men's jobs in the factories. But it's the other way round. Women had to fight to be allowed to help with the war. And this is what Mrs. Pankhurst is doing. In 1915, she organises the Women's Right to Serve March. 40,000 women marched through London, trying to convince the government and trade unions to take them on in munitions factories. This might seem very strange if you believe that all these women were pampered housewives in 1913. But aside from ideological support for the war, there are practical reasons you might want a job in a munitions factory. A large portion of women had effectively become single mothers overnight. Remember that there's no equal pay law yet. A woman is generally paid somewhere between a third and a half of what a man gets, and it's really hard to sustain yourself and a baby on that. Even if you're not that fussed about the war, you need money, and yet the horror of letting women into your factory, your office, your workshop was so strong that women had to go on marches to be allowed in them. One writer says, think of the hours spent in organising a march of 40,000 through London. Think of the waste of energy, wasted solely because all the time these women were begging to serve, they might have been serving. Think of the potential output of some 40,000 women working for, say, 8 hours a day, and then wonder we are laughed at? And it's not just munitions factories. Suffragettes are trying to get into all kinds of jobs previously done by men. Suffragettes like Nina Boyle established the first women's police force. Evelina Haverfield and Decima Moore set up the Women's Emergency Corps, the leading women's volunteer organisation. Suffragettes are among the first to sign up for the Army and Navy when they start accepting women in 1917. Mabel Sinclair Stobart tried to get to the front with the British Red Cross, but they wouldn't take women. So she founded the Women's National Service League and worked alongside the Belgian Red Cross instead. She set up one hospital in Belgium, one in Cherbourg, and one in the Balkans. When she had to retreat through the mountains, she became known as the Lady on the Black Horse, spending up to 18 hours a day on horseback for 12 weeks, covering 800 miles. The NUWSS ran a hospital at Roymont Abbey, run and staffed by women, which treated over 10,000 soldiers during the war. I've spoken in the past about white feathering, which was basically a wave of teenage bullying that happened at the start of the war when there was almost a fever for joining up across the whole country. It's really hard to overstate how marginal a position being against the war was in 1914, since when we think about it now, we tend to think about Wilfred Owen and Gast and Blackadder Goes Forth. For the first 2 years of the war, the entire British Army was volunteers. Army recruitment centres had queues round the block, and basically there was a Navy Admiral called Charles Fitzgerald who said that women should shame men into joining up by going up to random men in the street who weren't wearing uniforms and handing them a white feather, a sign of cowardice. Now, this is obviously gross and awful. There are several accounts of really disgusting bullying where men are surrounded and yelled at in public and then head straight down to the recruiting office and go to France to get blown up. It's horrific. I agree with you. And if you think suffragettes were doing it, then I'm afraid you've been lied to. I'd be surprised if you can find the name of any particular woman who was doing it, to be honest. Almost every account just says young ladies or fashionable girls. These were teenagers, mean girls, who found a way that they could bully local lads and get away with it. I don't want to downplay the severity of it. This is bullying someone into getting killed. But I would like you to have a think about the person who told you it was suffragettes doing it. Because that person lied to you, and you shouldn't trust them again. I've already talked about how there's no evidence that Emmeline Pankhurst gave out white feathers. Historic UK has an article saying that she did this on their website, and there's no source at all. Frankly, they should be ashamed of this piece, which, if she wasn't long dead, I would consider libellous. As far as I can tell, she never even wrote about it at any time during her entire life, and she wrote a lot of words. The closest I can find is one account from the 1930s saying that the writer went to one of her speeches and saw women there with white feathers. So not her. Her speech doesn't mention white feathers. She never encourages people to give out white feathers. It's just a lie. But if you're horrified by the thought of being forced to go to war, then you know who agrees with you. We, the women of the world, view with apprehension and dismay the present situation in Europe, which threatens to involve a continent, if not the whole world, in the disasters and horrors of war. Powerless though we are politically, we call upon the governments and powers of our several countries to avert the threatened unparalleled disaster. Eleanor Barton of the Women's Cooperative Guild said that everywhere women were against the war, especially working women, who know what it means not only to have those they love taken from them, but to see their children in need of food. She would go on to promote the use of the white poppy in the 1930s as a symbol for peace. In general, the pacifist movement was pretty tiny in Britain in World War I, but the few pacifists there were tended to be suffragists too. The Workers' Suffrage League used the slogan, "Peace, Socialism, Votes for All." Sylvia Pankhurst, Charlotte Despard, Emmeline and Frederick Pethick Lawrence, all suffragists who speak out in favour of peace. Helen Crawford organises thousands of people into the Women's Peace Crusade. A report of one of Mrs. Pethick Lawrence's speeches said, "She did not say there was no cause worth the sacrifice of human life, but it was for the women of those countries, as well as the men, to determine what cause was to be served by the slaughter of their sons." This is not an easy position to take in 1910s Britain. If you're a man of conscriptable age, then you'd risk prison or court-martial saying something like this. So you need women and older male allies who can fight that fight for you. And all of them lose credibility for it. One letter in the Hastings Observer says, "The thoughtful woman voter will know that advocates of compromise with the obscene, brutal and barbarous Hun cannot possibly be true friends to women." So the campaign for votes for women wasn't totally off during the war, but suffragists did have other priorities. One thing people were worried about was soldiers' rights. Remember, even men needed a certain amount of property in order to vote, so there were millions of working class lads who were being sent to France to die with no say over the government that sent them. So in 1918, Parliament passes the Representation of the People Act, which is mostly aimed at giving soldiers better voting rights, and there's one clause about some women getting to vote too. It's not quite on the same terms as men. The government is well aware that a lot of men have died, and it does not want to make the electorate more than half female. So women have to be over 30. We don't get the same equal terms with men on the vote for another 10 years. I also feel that I should address your worries about the draft, since I get a lot of comments about it and it's clearly something you're worried about. So I had to do a bit of research to understand what these comments were about, since we don't have a draft in this country. And in World War II, British women were drafted. So I guess the US still has a draft that you have to sign up for, and I will take your word for it that it's connected to the vote somehow. It's not my country, I don't know. But I do know that if I lived in a country with a draft, I would be scared too. That's terrifying. I would absolutely be voting for politicians who promise to scrap it. Probably wouldn't be blaming long-dead British suffragettes for it, but fear makes you do silly things sometimes. If you feel crushed, powerless, by forces who need not listen to you, afraid of being sent to war, then women fighting for their own liberation are not your enemy. The people sending you to war are your enemy, obviously. The idea that the vote and military service are at all connected in British history is just obviously wrong if you think about it. Like, do you think the people who fought Napoleon, whom the Duke of Wellington called the scum of the earth, could vote? Do you think guys getting impressed into the Navy in the 1830s could vote? Do you think those poor 19-year-olds at the Battle of the Somme could vote? Friends, they can draft you and still not give you the vote. I don't like picking out individual weird comments and holding them up as evidence of a massive trend, so when I went to write this portion of the video, I went looking for some prominent person who actually thinks this. Like, where are these commenters getting this idea from? I don't like punching down at 2 follower accounts. Let's find someone who has power that I can reply to instead. But I found nothing. The best I could find was like this one blog post that doesn't seem to have been particularly influential. So like, where are you guys getting this? Because I know you didn't get it from a book or from a historian. You don't need to be a historian to know that a lot of soldiers in World War I couldn't vote. Did you get your opinion from a tweet? A podcast? Did a YouTuber give you this opinion? Look, it's happened to all of us. YouTubers are just very good looking and persuasive, and it's very easy to believe what we say without thinking about it too hard. But now, you know what it feels like to get an opinion on autopilot without checking it or even thinking about it for 5 minutes, so you can watch out for it happening again. What was it about this particular opinion that appealed to you so much that you bit into it without even polishing the dirt off on your shirt first? Look out for those. And don't pick one up again without checking it. And definitely don't then write that opinion down without checking it. I check so much stuff before I say it here. I have sources in my description. Every long video represents me reading entire books. And when I realise I've said something wrong, I put a correction in the description. I have something else to say about this question, and that is that I had to spend up time looking up what the laws are on conscription in a country that's very far away, that I don't plan to go to, and that I do not make videos about. I didn't spend long on it, but I have wasted precious hours on this earth because multiple Americans assumed that because our societies do share a lot of history, that we must share that bit too. And they didn't even check. I had to check for them. I could have spent that time doing literally anything else. I could have been reading about the connection between the suffrage movement and Irish independence. I could have been learning about how British suffrage affected the colonies like India. I could have been bird watching. But I didn't do those things because Irish and Indian people don't come into my comment section with this accusing tone, implying that I like it when people are conscripted into wars and demanding I explain the seemingly obvious fact that my country's history isn't the same as theirs. But if they did, maybe I'd have learned more about my neighbour country and less about the fucking 19th Amendment.
Were they fascists? No. So first off, fascism and the suffrage movement don't exist at the same time. So if you go round talking about suffragettes being fascists, then you're going to give the impression that you'd be hearing about sinister Jewish cabals at your suffrage meetings, which just didn't happen and would be really irresponsible of me as a historian to say. What is true is that 3 women who were in the suffrage movement went on to have positions in the British Union of Fascists 2 decades later. This is Mary Richardson, Nora Elam and Mary Allen, who were all involved in the BUF in the 1920s and 1930s. Maybe there are more rank and file members that I haven't been able to find, but as far as I can tell, there were 3 former suffragists organising in the British fascist movement. 3. Out of a movement of thousands of people. Now, it does seem weird that anyone who supported women's suffrage would go on to support fascism. I think that's why they stand out to people so much over other people who joined the fascist movement. We often think of women's rights as a left-wing thing and fascism as a right-wing thing, but suffrage is just power. And people all over the political spectrum want power. Wanting the vote says nothing about how you would use it. We also sometimes have a tendency to believe that if you see someone express fascist sympathies, that means they've been a fascist the whole time and are just letting the mask slip. But this isn't correct either. No one's born a fascist. What's much more common is that people get radicalised into fascism, and supporting votes for women isn't a foolproof defence against that. What we need to ask is, was a suffragette more likely to become a fascist than any other person? And the answer is no. In fact, out of the thousands of women who went on suffrage marches, who were used to being politically active and had strong opinions, and given how popular fascism was in Britain in the 1930s, statistically, I think someone's less likely to become a fascist if they were a suffragette. There were more fascist aristocrats than fascist former suffragettes. The Earl of Glasgow and Viscountess Down both joined the BUF. Lord Russell was identified by MI5 as someone Nazi Germany would set up as a puppet ruler if they successfully invaded. Viscount Rothermere's newspaper printed pro-fascist articles, and Diana Mitford literally married the head of the BUF. And there are plenty of suffragettes who go the other way and become very left-wing that you don't tend to hear about as much. The thing is about the 1930s is that there's a Great Depression on, and nothing the government is doing is fixing it. When people in power can't seem to do anything, people start looking for alternatives, on both ends of the political spectrum. On the right, fascism has a huge surge in the 1930s, but on the left, so does communism and socialism. The East London Federation of Suffragettes eventually turns into a socialist movement called the Workers' Suffrage Federation. Suffragists who become communists include Sylvia Pankhurst, Dora Montefiore, May O'Callaghan, Ethel Murphy, Helen Crawford, and Rose and Nellie Cohen. Adela Pankhurst moves to Australia and helps found both an Australian Communist Party and an Australian fascist party, which seems completely politically incoherent today. This idea that the suffragettes were more fascist than regular people is relatively common. I've seen people whom I mostly agree with argue this, but we gotta stop. It's just not true. All it does is plant the idea that you should be sceptical of people fighting for their liberty, because they're just gonna turn around and oppress you back the way they were oppressed. It makes people suspicious of groups they should have solidarity with. Knock it off. I've been answering the questions in this video as if they're genuinely being asked, because sometimes they are, but the truth is that they're often not. Women's suffrage might seem like a settled matter to you, something that's in the past, but the people who ask these questions are often not doing it from a point of curiosity. They do not want to know the answer, and they do not want to learn about the complex nuances of real-life liberation movements. They want to paint the suffragettes in a bad light. They're not outright going to say that feminism is bad because they know you'd disagree with that, and they'd risk getting banned off their platforms. Instead, they give you all the puzzle pieces so that you come to that conclusion by yourself. And a conclusion you think you've reached on your own is going to stick in your brain much better than one you've been told. And if you ever accuse them of supporting that conclusion, they've got plausible deniability. But they'll make sure to only give you the pieces that make up the picture they want you to make. What you have to do is go rooting around under the table for the pieces you haven't been given. These criticisms will often seem to come from the left. They're about the suffragettes being secretly racist or classist or fascist. But this is a tactical manoeuvre, not a sincere question. They don't actually care about the racism or classism of long-dead Edwardians. They just want you, an enlightened, modern, liberal person, to start thinking of feminists as your enemies. They are not. But every now and again, someone asks a question that matters.
Does it work? Do the militant suffragettes change anything? Did burning down cricket pavilions help anything? This is something historians still debate, and I don't think we're ever going to get a definitive answer. One thing you can say is that it definitely didn't hurt the movement enough to stop women getting the vote in the end, but you could argue that it slowed the movement down. It stopped us getting the vote earlier than we otherwise would have. I think you'd need evidence for that, but you could argue it. Or you could argue that it spurred politicians to get something done about it earlier than they would have otherwise. This is something that suffragettes and suffragists are thinking about a lot. They're constantly writing about whether militant action works, and the militant suffragettes are thinking about it even more than everybody else. Emmeline Pethick-Lawrence writes, "When men are held down under laws which they have not made and which they have no power to change, then invariably there is revolt. And with men, revolt means violence and bloodshed." It's worth remembering that the suffragist movement goes on for 40 years before anyone starts getting militant about it. That's 40 years of failed petitions, failed bills in Parliament, failed letters to politicians. At a certain point, I think Emmeline Pankhurst can be forgiven for deciding that peaceful methods aren't working. How long do you wait before you start breaking things? Something I think you can't dispute is that the militant part of the movement does bring the topic to the forefront of the national conversation. If you can't get headlines without something violent happening, then newspapers are giving you a foolproof way of making headlines. If it bleeds, it leads, then make it bleed. But on the other hand, you do have to acknowledge that you are going to turn people off the movement who otherwise would have supported you. Teresa Billington-Gregg is a really great example of this. She was a big follower of Emmeline Pankhurst at the beginning. She was one of the first suffragettes sent to Holloway Prison, but she leaves the WSPU in 1907 because she disagrees with how the Pankhursts are running the movement. She goes off to form a splinter group, and then in 1910 she leaves that too because they're getting too militant. That is somebody who would have been a great ally, who was frankly an incredible writer, who would have been working for the movement for years longer if you hadn't turned them off. You've also got to acknowledge that if the public are afraid of you, they're not going to want to support you, even if that fear is not rational. Now, traditionally, the way protest movements get around this is by making the public more afraid of police and state violence than they are of protest violence. So, for example, when news got out that the suffragettes were being force-fed, that drove a lot of sympathy to the suffragettes. But if you want to use that tactic, you have to be willing to let the police do violence to you. And if you're not, you can't tell other people to do it. I would have been a rubbish suffragette. I once got questioned by 2 police officers on the street. I didn't even get arrested, and I cried. I would have been terrible, let alone being arrested and put in an Edwardian prison. So you've got to know what militant actions are for. They're not for convincing people to join you, they're for convincing people to talk about you. All the major liberation movements of this country's history, Indian nationalism, gay rights, the abolition of slavery, they all had wings that were, if not violent, then at least militant, aggressive, loud, annoying. Whereas the largest protest in this country in my lifetime was the 2003 march against the Iraq War, which had over 1 million participants and changed nothing. Blocking roads, smashing windows, chaining yourselves to railings, that's for getting people to talk about you. It's not that nothing ever gets done by peaceful means, but if peaceful means aren't working, you can see why people think militant means might be more effective. There have been lots of 21st century protest movements that have been inspired by the suffragettes, notably the climate action group Just Stop Oil, who glue themselves to roads, like the suffragettes chained themselves to railings, who climbed the cables of the Dartford Crossing Bridge in 2022, and who smashed the glass on the Rokeby Venus painting in an echo of Mary Richardson's attack on the same painting back in the 1910s, although they just broke the glass and Mary Richardson stabbed that canvas 7 times. News of these protests is often met with disgust. When the group flower-bombed Stonehenge, the then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called it a disgraceful act of vandalism, and the opposition leader Keir Starmer called it outrageous. Why target Stonehenge? Stonehenge isn't dumping 4.9 million barrels of oil in the Gulf of Mexico. But that's not the point of the protest. The protest isn't to convince Stonehenge to be more environmentally friendly. The protest is to convince you and the newspapers to talk about climate change. Just so you're not worried, Stonehenge is fine. English Heritage, who look after Stonehenge, have said it's fine, and that wasn't as widely reported as the headlines assuming it wasn't fine, but it is. Now, Just Stop Oil do target people who deserve it. They do target oil terminals, but that doesn't make headlines, so you don't hear about it. If you want to get headlines, you have to do something that gets headlines. Now, unless you're a complete pacifist, you probably don't think that violence is never justified. Think about liberating a concentration camp or punching someone who hurt your kid. But criticism of the group almost never comes against their cause, but against their tactics. What a humiliating admission to say that your opinion on whether or not a cause is just can be changed by whether its proponents are annoying or not. If you would condemn climbing up the Dartford Bridge not because of the cause that activists are doing it for, but because that tactic should be totally off the table, then you would have condemned the suffragettes as well. And if you've been taught that the suffragettes were correct and righteous, that might not be a comfortable thought to have. So your brain might try and deal with that dissonance by claiming that the suffragettes were some kind of exception. But this is just a tactic so that your brain doesn't have to answer the real question, which is, how long should activists have to wait before getting militant?
Thank you for watching. I just finished recording the statue sequence. I had to get in the shower, obviously, to wash all the clay off. That's why my hair's wet. I wrote a book. Did you know I wrote a book? Like a whole book that is out now? It's called Mavericks, Life Stories and Lessons of History's Most Extraordinary Misfits. And each chapter is about a different person in history who had a weird life. So, for example, we talk about La Chevalière d'Eon, who came out as a woman in 18th century London. We talk about Ellen and William Craft, who escaped slavery in the south of the US by dressing Ellen up as a white man. And we talk about Peter the Wild Boy, who was found living in the woods in Germany and brought to live at the British court. So each chapter is basically like a whole long video, and there are 24 of these bad boys. I spent a really long time writing this. I had to read a lot of books for it, so I hope you enjoy it. It is available in hardback, ebook and audiobook formats from all your favourite bookstores. Thank you so much.
I come back up. Thank you.